Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into a chilling true story that began as an ordinary flight into London's Stansted Airport, but within minutes it spiraled into one of the most haunting near disasters in modern aviation. Passengers buckled in, unaware that above the soft hum of engines and polite announcements, a silent chain of errors was already forming. The weather was calm, the sky a gentle gray blanket over the English countryside, and the pilots expected a routine descent. But at 5,000 feet the calm shattered. Warning alarms pierced the cockpit, controls stiffened, and the aircraft began to sink faster than anyone realized. What followed was 20 minutes of pure chaos, courage, and impossible decision-making, a desperate fight against time, gravity, and fate. The flight had departed earlier from Spain with 176 passengers on board, families, business travelers, and children returning home. The captain, a veteran with thousands of flight hours, had flown this route countless times. His first officer was young but sharp, eager to prove himself. They had no reason to believe this night would be different. But as the plane entered UK airspace, small indicators began to flicker. The autopilot struggled to hold altitude. The captain frowned but dismissed it as a minor software quirk. Outside, sheets of cold drizzle brushed the cockpit glass, reflecting distant lights from other aircraft stacked for landing. Then came the first jolt, a shudder through the fuselage so sudden it silenced conversation in the cabin. In the cockpit, the captain felt it too. "That wasn't turbulence," he muttered. Moments later, the control column grew heavy, resisting every input. Alarms erupted. Stall, stall. The plane wasn't actually stalling. It was falling victim to a misread from a faulty air data system, feeding the wrong speed into the flight computers. The autopilot disengaged violently, throwing the jet into manual control. The first officer gripped the yoke, his voice tight. "We've lost the computers." The captain took over, steadying the aircraft as the altitude tape spun downward. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the aircraft suddenly dipped nose down, trays crashing, oxygen masks trembling. One mother clutched her son's hand and whispered a prayer. A businessman stared out the window, watching the lights of London spinning closer, too fast, too bright. In the control tower at Stansted, air traffic controllers saw the altitude drop on their screens and froze. "Flight 271, you're descending below clearance. Confirm your altitude." Static filled the air. The radar blip flickered. Then, a broken voice crackled back. "We're trying to stabilize. Flight control issues. Declaring emergency." Every controller in the room fell silent. Emergency procedures kicked in instantly. Runway cleared, rescue units scrambled, and incoming flights rerouted into holding patterns. But inside that cockpit, the real war had begun. The captain fought the controls as if wrestling a living thing. The airspeed indicators disagreed. One showed overspeed, the other underspeed. One wrong correction could tear the plane apart or stall it completely. The first officer tried to isolate the fault, reading out checklists while sweat dripped down his temple. "We've lost our reference data, sir, instruments unreliable." The captain's jaw clenched. "Then we fly by feel." At 5,000 feet, that decision was madness, but it was their only chance. Outside, the world blurred into mist and flashing strobes. The engines roared unevenly as the pilot manually adjusted thrust, feeling for balance. Every move was instinct. The flight deck smelled of ozone and fear, the alarms relentless. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin crew tried to calm passengers, their voices trembling. One stewardess held the intercom, whispering to another, "They're fighting for us." In the tower, the supervisor leaned over the microphone. "Flight 271, you're still descending. Pull up immediately." The captain didn't respond. He couldn't. He was too busy saving 200 lives with his bare hand. Then came the scream of overspeed, an angry wail that meant they were diving too fast. The nose pitched up too sharply. The passengers were slammed into their seat. Coffee sprayed through the air. Somewhere, a child cried out for his father. The G-forces pinned the crew against their harnesses. The first officer shouted readings, each one worse than the last. Altitude 4,000. 39. 38. At 3,500 feet, the captain made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Cut thrust 1. Keep 2 and 3. By unbalancing the engines, he forced the aircraft to yaw just enough to break the aerodynamic lock. The jet wobbled violently, then steadied. The first officer gasped. "We're leveling." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The passengers felt the descent ease, their stomachs still tight with terror. In the tower, someone exhaled audibly. But they weren't safe yet. The faulty sensors continued feeding chaos into the flight system, and the weather was worsening fast. Heavy rain lashed the cockpit, streaking across the windshield like molten glass. The captain switched to full manual control, something few pilots had practiced in years. No automation. Just us. The young first officer nodded, his voice shaking. "Yes, Captain." They flew blind, relying on instincts older than modern aviation, hands trembling but precise. Each second stretched into eternity as they edged closer to the runway approach. In the cabin, passengers began to pray aloud. Some held hands with strangers. Others recorded final messages on their phones, their whispers lost in the engine's roar. A flight attendant moved from row to row, tears streaking her face but a brave smile on her lips. "We'll be okay," she said, over and over, as if the words themselves could hold the plane together. Outside, the storm cracked open, lightning illuminating the wings, one of which was coated in ice. The de-icing system had failed minutes ago. Ice was now building on the leading edges, stealing lift with every heartbeat. The control tower could only listen to the chaos unfolding through broken transmissions. "We've got icing on the left side, controls sluggish," came the captain's voice, distorted but steady. "We'll attempt manual landing." Controllers exchanged glances. No one attempted manual landings in this weather, not from 5,000 feet, not with failing instruments. But there was no other choice. The runway lights burned through the rain like candles in fog. The first officer spotted them first. Visual acquired, runway 34. The captain's knuckles were white on the yoke. "Then we're going home." As the aircraft broke through the final layer of cloud, the city spread below them, tiny, unaware, peaceful. The landing gear deployed with a shudder that rattled every bolt. The first officer read out the descent speed manually. 150 knots, 148, looking good. The wind howled. The rain streaked sideways. The captain adjusted pitch, fighting the crosswind. "Hold her steady. Don't let her bite." The runway loomed closer, distorted by water and motion. The ground proximity warning screamed, "Terrain, terrain, pull up!" He ignored it. At 200 feet, they lost visual in a sudden gust. The plane rolled left. The first officer shouted, "Wings level." The captain slammed the rudder, correcting the drift by instinct alone. The main gear hit hard, skidding through sheets of water, tires screaming, reverse thrust roaring like thunder. In the tower, no one breathed until the transmission crackled through the radio. Stansted Tower. Flight 271 on the ground. Applause broke out across the control room, followed by silence as the full weight of what they had witnessed sank in. On the runway, rescue vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Inside, passengers sobbed, hugged, and stared at each other in disbelief. The captain removed his headset, his hands trembling for the first time since the ordeal began. He looked at his young first officer and said quietly, "You did good, kid." Investigators would later learn that a combination of faulty sensors, software logic errors, and ice accumulation had nearly caused the plane to fall from the sky. The crew's decision to disconnect automation and fly by instinct had saved everyone on board. Their courage would be studied in training programs worldwide, a testament to what human instinct can achieve when technology fails. As dawn broke over Stansted that morning, the damaged aircraft sat quietly at the end of the runway, its wings still dripping with rain. Inside the cockpit, the first officer lingered, staring out at the horizon. "How close were we?" he finally asked. The captain smiled faintly, exhausted. "Too close." And with that, they stepped into history, not as heroes seeking glory, but as two men who refused to let fear take the controls. If you found this story as gripping as we did, and you want to hear more real-life tales of courage, chaos, and survival in the sky, consider subscribing to the channel. Stay safe, and remember, the line between disaster and miracle is often just the courage to keep flying. The investigation that followed the Stansted near-disaster would take months, but the truth behind those final minutes began to surface long before the wreckage was even cool. The night after the landing, the captain sat alone in the debriefing room, still in his damp uniform, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched coffee. The sounds of sirens echoed faintly outside as emergency crews combed the runway, collecting evidence from a jet that had barely survived its own descent. Investigators from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch arrived before dawn. They photographed every inch of the cockpit, traced every circuit, and downloaded the flight data recorders. But even before the numbers were analyzed, one thing was clear: the aircraft had defied the odds. Every simulation run by experts later would show that under the same circumstances, 90% of crews would have lost control within minutes. What saved Flight 271 was not procedure, but something less tangible: the captain's refusal to surrender to the machine. As news broke across Europe, headlines screamed about the miracle over Stansted. Survivors were interviewed on television, their faces pale and eyes wide as they recounted the horror. One passenger, an elderly woman named Margaret, described how she had looked out the window and seen only blackness and flashes of lightning. "I could feel us falling," she said softly. "The stewardess was crying, but still smiling at us. I thought I'd never see the ground again." Her words struck millions who watched that morning. Another man said he had gripped the armrests so tightly his hands were bruised. Yet, amid the chaos, a strange calm had spread through the cabin in those final seconds before touchdown, a stillness that no one could explain. Survivors later said it was as if the aircraft itself wanted to live. Behind the scenes, investigators pieced together the nightmare that had unfolded at 5,000 feet. The culprit appeared to be a pedostatic failure caused by a microscopic crack in one of the airspeed sensors. At high altitude, a droplet of water had frozen inside the tubing, feeding the flight computer's wildly incorrect data. The autopilot, trusting those readings, had forced the aircraft to pitch downward to prevent a phantom stall. When the pilots fought back, the systems countered, leading to a violent oscillation that threatened to tear the jet apart. The engineers who designed the system had never imagined a simultaneous sensor failure in that pattern. It was, as one investigator put it, a perfect storm of physics and software. For the captain, the discovery offered little comfort. During the inquiry, officials replayed the cockpit voice recorder in a sterile conference room filled with officials, lawyers, and safety experts. The recording began with ordinary chatter, the two pilots discussing weather, fuel, and football scores. Then came the alarms, the confusion, the shouts. "Pull up! No data! Trust your hands!" The captain listened silently, his jaw tight. When the recording reached the sound of impact on the runway, followed by the collective gasp of the cabin crew, he closed his eyes. The room fell silent. After a long pause, one investigator asked softly, "At what point did you realize you might not make it?" The captain answered without looking up. "When I stopped trusting the instruments," he said. "That's when I realized it was up to us alone." Meanwhile, the control tower staff at Stansted were still shaken. For years, those controllers had watched emergencies unfold from the safety of their screens, but none had ever witnessed such a rapid descent that ended in survival. The senior controller, a woman named Dana Keats, later said she'd frozen for half a second when the blip began to plummet. "You train for it, but when it happens you still feel it in your bones," she explained. I could hear the panic in the first officer's voice through the static. I knew they were fighting death up there. After the event, Dana visited the crew personally. When she saw them, she hugged the first officer and whispered, "You did it." He smiled faintly, still pale, and replied, "I'm not sure how." In the weeks that followed, the airline grounded its entire fleet for inspections. Mechanics worked day and night replacing sensors, testing redundancies, and rewriting protocols. But what haunted many wasn't the mechanical fault. It was how close they had come to disaster without ever knowing it was possible. Pilots everywhere began sharing stories of similar warnings, small inconsistencies they had brushed off. Aviation schools began rewriting their manuals to emphasize something technology had almost erased: instinct. "Automation can't feel the wind," one veteran instructor told his class. "But you can." As the investigation deepened, something else emerged: an untold layer of human endurance that had played out in the cabin. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Elena, became a quiet hero. When she realized the plane was losing altitude, she didn't scream or freeze. She unbuckled, steadied herself against the seats, and moved through the aisle to comfort the children first. "Look at me," she told them, her voice steady though her hands shook. "You're going to hear loud noises, but we'll be okay." Later, when the aircraft struck the runway, she was thrown forward, dislocating her shoulder, yet she continued guiding passengers to the exits once they stopped. Every passenger survived, though several required treatment for shock. In the aftermath, when the damaged jet was finally towed from the runway, the early morning light revealed something chilling: scratches across the fuselage where debris had struck during descent, inches from rupturing the cabin wall. One engineer who examined the exterior whispered, "If they'd hit 1 degree steeper, they'd be gone." The captain visited the hangar weeks later to see the aircraft for himself. The smell of fuel and wet concrete hung in the air. He ran a hand over the scars on the metal, and stood there for a long time. Reporters waited outside, but he said nothing to them. He only murmured to the plane, "You did your part. Thank you." Months later, the official report was released. The conclusion read simply: probable cause, erroneous flight data due to ice blockage, compounded by over-reliance on automation. But buried deeper in the document, in a paragraph few journalists noticed, was a line that summed up everything. Survival was achieved through manual recovery by flight crew, displaying exceptional situational awareness and decision-making under extreme conditions. It was a bureaucratic way of saying that 2 human beings had done the impossible. The world soon moved on, as it always does. The passengers went back to their lives, the airline resumed its schedules, and the news cycle turned to other stories. But for those who had been there, for the pilots, the crew, the controllers, something had changed forever. The next time they boarded an aircraft or looked up at a contrail crossing the sky, they no longer saw a machine. They saw a fragile miracle kept alive by faith, courage, and the thin line between logic and instinct. For the captain, the nightmares took longer to fade. In the quiet of his home, he would sometimes wake before dawn, hearing phantom alarms echoing in his dreams. He'd walk to the window, stare at the stars, and remember the sound of his co-pilot's voice, steady even when everything else had fallen apart. He never spoke publicly about that night again, but those who knew him said he kept a small photograph in his logbook, a picture of the passengers taken the day after, smiling on the tarmac, alive. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, he had written 6 words: "Trust the sky. But trust yourself more." That phrase became part of aviation lore, quoted in training sessions and safety seminars for years afterward. It reminded everyone that no matter how advanced technology became, the human element, courage, intuition, and the will to fight, remained the final safeguard. The story of the Stansted near-disaster would echo across generations, a lesson written in fear, sweat, and rain. And though the world called it a miracle, the people who were there knew better. It wasn't luck. It was humanity refusing to surrender at 5,000 feet. As the months passed and headlines faded, the Stansted near-disaster slipped quietly from the public's attention, but for those who lived through it, the memory never dimmed. The passengers carried the trauma like an invisible scar, each recalling that long night in fragments. The screams, the oxygen masks that never fell, the lightning slicing across the wings, and the way the world had tilted and trembled until gravity itself seemed to lose meaning. Some couldn't step on another airplane for years. Others forced themselves to fly again, whispering silent prayers during takeoff, hearts pounding until the wheels touched earth once more. Yet among them all, one story continued to grow, the legend of the two men who had brought that aircraft home when everything said they shouldn't have. For the captain, whose name was now known to every pilot in the industry, fame became a strange burden. He received medals, commendations, interviews, even offers from major airlines to train new recruits. But he turned most of them down. He often told reporters, "Courage is a word people use when they don't understand fear. We weren't brave, we were scared to death. We just didn't stop." His co-pilot, younger and more open, struggled more with the aftermath. The image of the instruments spinning out of control replayed endlessly in his mind. He attended therapy arranged by the airline but spent hours afterward driving alone, chasing the feeling of control that had nearly been stolen from him. The airline itself faced its reckoning. Under pressure from regulators and the press, they invited journalists to tour their maintenance hangars, hoping transparency would rebuild trust. Cameras panned over rows of spotless engines, technicians tightening bolts, and engineers explaining new safety upgrade. But no broadcast could erase the haunting truth that for a full 6 minutes, Flight 271 had been falling blind through the clouds, and no computer on Earth had known how to save it. The CEO stood before the cameras, his voice solemn. "We have the most advanced technology in aviation," he said. "But technology is only as good as the humans who guide it." It was a corporate statement, yet it carried a quiet reverence for the pilots who had made the impossible choice, to trust their instincts over their instruments. Meanwhile, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch delved deeper. They wanted to understand how such a small flaw could nearly end in tragedy. They recreated the incident in full-motion simulators using the same weather data, same route, same conditions. One by one, crews from various airlines tried to save the simulated aircraft, and one by one, they failed. The autopilot disengaged, the warnings blared, the plane dove. Some recovered for a few moments before losing control again. Others crashed within seconds. The investigators watched in grim silence. When they played back the flight data from the real event, one thing stood out. The captain's control inputs were not by the book. He had gone against procedure, had intentionally unbalanced the thrust on one side to break the aerodynamic lock. On paper, it was reckless. In practice, it had saved them all. The report later concluded that his unorthodox decision demonstrated profound understanding of aircraft dynamics under extreme duress. In aviation circles, that single decision became a subject of endless debate. Some argued it was luck, that any deviation from standard protocol could have worsened the situation. Others called it genius, but those who had sat in cockpits for decades knew what it really was: experience distilled into instinct. A lifetime of flying reduced to a single choice made in the space of a heartbeat. The captain himself refused to discuss it publicly. "I didn't think," he told one journalist during a rare interview. "I just felt the plane. It told me what it needed." To anyone outside the industry, it sounded mystical. To other pilots, it made perfect sense. Back in Stansted, the control tower team received awards of their own. For their calm coordination during the crisis, they were commended by the Civil Aviation Authority. But the controllers themselves didn't feel heroic. They had watched a falling aircraft and been powerless to help. Dana Keats, the tower's supervisor, returned to work just days later but found herself flinching every time an altitude warning blared. "You can't unsee something like that," she admitted quietly. You hear a pilot's voice shaking and you know they're looking death in the face, and you can't do a damn thing but talk. Her words echoed the helplessness of everyone on the ground that night. As for the passengers, many formed an unlikely bond. Some started a private online group called Survivors of 271. They shared nightmares, photos, updates about their lives. Every year on the anniversary of the flight, they gathered near Stansted for a small vigil, flowers laid at the perimeter fence, candles flickering against the wind. No media, no speeches. Just silence, and the faint hum of distant engines landing safely under the same night sky. The captain never attended those gatherings, but he always sent a handwritten note, still flying, still thankful. By the 1-year mark, the story had evolved from headline to legend. Training schools used it as a case study in human resilience. The phrase fly by feel became a quiet mantra whispered by pilots in simulators when systems glitched. Documentaries replayed the cockpit voice recordings, dramatizing every desperate call. But the truth remained simpler and more haunting. Those two men had done what no computer could because they refused to stop believing in their own senses. The investigation closed officially with its final report, a 1,000-page document filled with data tables and charts, yet its last line said everything that mattered. The survival of Flight 271 was not the result of mechanical reliability, but of human courage and judgment under extraordinary stress. And still, something lingered. A mystery that no instrument, no data recorder could explain. The captain's own logbook showed that the moment he applied asymmetric thrust, just seconds before the plane stabilized, there had been an unexplained electrical surge through the flight system. The engineers couldn't account for it. It hadn't come from the engines, nor from the auxiliary power. It was as if, for a split second, the aircraft had powered itself. When asked about it, the captain smiled faintly and said, "Maybe she wanted to live too." The engineers laughed nervously, calling it coincidence. But among the flight crews who read the report, that line became legend. Some whispered that aircraft remember their pilots, that in moments of crisis, man and machine become one. Late one evening, long after the investigation ended, the captain visited the simulator again. Alone, he sat in the same seat, the same darkness, the same alarms programmed to replay the descent exactly as it had happened. The screens flashed red, the warning horns blared. His hands tightened on the yoke, memories surging like ghosts. He flew the sequence again, every second, every scream of the engines. When it was over, the simulator froze at the moment the plane touched down. He sat there in silence, his breathing shallow. Then he whispered into the empty cockpit, "You did good." It wasn't clear if he meant the co-pilot, the aircraft, or himself. Outside, rain began to fall, the same kind of cold, relentless rain that had covered London the night of the near disaster. And as it tapped against the simulator's roof, he allowed himself to close his eyes for the first time in years without hearing alarms or feeling the pull of gravity dragging him down. The world had called it a miracle, but to him it was something else, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between life and death really is, and how sometimes, in the heart of the storm, it's not the instruments or the systems that save us. It's the human instinct to keep fighting, even when the sky itself turns against you. In the years that followed, Flight 271 became a case study, not just in aviation, but in the psychology of survival. The airframe was retired, stripped down to its skeleton, and placed in a private hangar at the Stansted Training Center. Pilots from across the world came to walk its aisle, to feel the grooves on the control yoke where the captain's hands had locked in those final seconds, to touch the cracked instrument panels that had betrayed their own readings. Many said standing inside that aircraft felt different, like stepping into a ghost story where the ghost wasn't malevolent, just watchful. Maintenance engineers swore that sometimes, when the hangar lights flickered at night, the faint sound of the overspeed alarm could still be heard echoing through the metal. No one knew if it was electrical interference or memory playing tricks. But everyone knew what that sound meant, the moment when man fought back against fate. The airline, under new management, poured millions into modernizing its fleet and technology. Every aircraft now came with triple redundant data systems, enhanced de-icing, and AI-driven diagnostics capable of identifying faults long before they became deadly. Yet, for all the technological upgrades, something else began to emerge in training programs around the world: a return to instinct. In simulator sessions, instructors started shutting off automation entirely midway through flights, forcing pilots to feel the airplane again, to listen to its vibration, to sense lift through muscle memory rather than numbers. They called it the Stansted drill, a tribute to the moment when two pilots proved that sometimes survival means ignoring everything you've been taught to trust. For the captain, life moved slower but no quieter. He retired 2 years later, quietly, without ceremony. When asked why, he said, "Because there's no higher flight after that one." He bought a small house in a rural part of Norfolk, surrounded by open fields where the sky stretched forever. Yet the sky no longer brought peace. Each low-flying jet overhead sent a tremor through his chest, a reminder of how close he'd come to never seeing it again. He kept a small study lined with aviation books and weathered flight maps, but at the center of his desk sat something far more personal: a fragment of metal from Flight 271's fuselage, polished smooth. Every morning, he would run his fingers over it as he sipped his coffee, lost in thought. To outsiders, he was a hero. To himself, he was just a man who'd borrowed more time than he deserved. The co-pilot's story, however, took a different path. Unable to fully shake the weight of what happened, he transferred to a smaller regional airline for a while, seeking a slower pace. But trauma doesn't respect new uniforms. One afternoon, during a descent into Dublin, light turbulence triggered the same warning tone that had haunted him since that night over Stansted. His hands froze. His chest locked. For a moment, he wasn't in Dublin. He was back in that cockpit, alarms screaming, rain hammering, death waiting at 5,000 feet. The captain beside him noticed immediately and gently took control. After landing, the younger man walked off the plane, removed his wings, and never flew again. Years later, he would become an instructor, teaching safety and decision-making, telling his students, "If you ever face the sky's worst, don't think you're alone. That's the mistake I made. We never were." Meanwhile, survivors of Flight 271 kept their annual vigil, but with each passing year, fewer attended. Life, as it always does, carried people forward. Children grew up, passengers aged, memories softened around the edges. But the story still lingered in quiet corners. The flight attendants who whispered it to recruits during training, the air traffic controller who placed a small framed radar screenshot on her desk, showing the moment the descent stopped, frozen forever at 3,480 feet. For her, it was proof that faith, even at its most desperate, sometimes wins. Yet, something deeper stirred beneath the surface of that legend. When the final accident report became public, buried in its appendices was an annex few noticed: a series of electrical anomalies recorded in the final minute of flight. Investigators couldn't explain them. The data showed a surge in energy readings that didn't align with any engine output or auxiliary power system. Some speculated it was interference caused by the lightning storm. Others believed it was the aircraft's aging circuitry misreporting under stress. But to the engineers who examined it closest, something about the readings felt unnatural. The surge had a rhythm, pulses occurring in perfect intervals like a heartbeat. One young technician remarked half-jokingly, "Maybe she was fighting too." The captain refused to comment on that anomaly during interviews. Yet in private letters discovered after his passing, he wrote something curious. "I could feel her, the plane. She was heavy, fighting herself, but she listened. When I cut the engines, I swear I felt her sigh. Like she wanted it to end but trusted me to land her first." To the rational mind, it sounded like the poetic rambling of an old man haunted by trauma. But to those who understood what happens in the crucible of survival, it was something more profound, a testament to the strange intimacy between human and machine, forged in fear, forged in trust. Years later, the old aircraft was dismantled. Its nose section was sent to a museum in London, its battered wings melted down for alloy reuse. But the cockpit, those 4 square meters of history, was preserved. It was mounted as a display, surrounded by panels describing the incident. A plaque beneath it read, "In this space, courage overcame chaos. Flight 271, 2015. Visitors often stood there in silence, some with tears, others with awe. Retired pilots who came to pay respects would stand quietly, their hands resting on the worn yoke, feeling something invisible pass between generations, a reminder that every life saved in the air began with one decision: to keep fighting no matter what." The captain lived long enough to see the exhibit open. He visited one evening after hours, escorted by museum staff. The hall was quiet, lights dimmed, the echoes of footsteps soft against the floor. He approached the cockpit, eyes tracing every familiar switch, every gauge frozen in time. He sat in his old seat, the leather cracked, the control column cold beneath his fingers. The ghosts were still there, the hiss of static, the distant rumble of thunder, the faint whisper of a young co-pilot calling out altitudes through the chaos. But for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt gratitude. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, whispering, "You carried us home." When he passed away a few years later, his ashes were scattered over the North Sea, as per his wishes. The airline flew a small memorial flight, circling once over Stansted before releasing a wreath into the clouds. The first officer, now a middle-aged man with silver in his hair, sat in the cockpit as honorary captain. As they passed over the coast, he whispered into the radio, "For you, sir." Somewhere far below, the waves caught the wreath and carried it away. And so, the story of Flight 271 became more than an incident report. It became a parable, a testament to the limits of human resilience, and to the quiet truth that sometimes, machines remember the hearts that guide them. To this day, pilots flying into Stansted still hear the whispers of that night in simulator briefings. Some glance at the storm clouds over the runway and think of the men who fought gravity and won. And when they land safely, stepping out into the rain-soaked tarmac, they sometimes look up and murmur, "Still flying. Still thankful." For in the end, that's all the sky ever asks of us: to keep faith when everything else falls away. To fight the descent. To trust that even in the darkest turbulence, there's a chance, however fragile, that the ground waiting below is still home. The years slipped by, but the shadow of Flight 271 never truly left the skies over England. The event had been dissected, studied, memorialized, and archived, yet its memory lingered like contrails that refused to fade. Pilots still spoke of it in hushed tones during layovers, trading stories about what they would have done in the captain's place, wondering if they'd have had the same calm, the same instinct, the same refusal to surrender. To the younger generation of aviators, it became a myth, a reminder that even in an era of perfect automation and flawless data, the human touch still mattered. By the 10th anniversary, the story resurfaced in a new light. A documentary team approached the surviving first officer, now a flight safety instructor, asking for permission to create a dramatized retelling of the Stansted descent. He declined at first. "It's not entertainment," he said quietly. "It's what happens when everything you rely on turns against you." But the producers persisted, promising respect, accuracy, and education. Finally, after weeks of reflection, he agreed, on one condition, that the film end not with triumph, but with silence. "Because that's how it really felt," he explained. "It wasn't victory. It was just relief." Filming began inside a replica cockpit built to exact specifications, every switch and lever matching the original. The first officer stood off camera during reenactments, coaching the actors, guiding them through every motion. When the actor playing the captain gripped the yoke and shouted over the alarms, "We fly her by feel," something inside him broke. He turned away, eyes glistening, and whispered to a crew member, "That's exactly what he said." For a moment, the noise of cameras and lights faded, and he was back in that cockpit again. Rain hammering the glass, alarms screaming, his mentor's voice steady as the world spun around them. When the documentary finally aired, it reached millions. Viewers sat in stunned silence as they watched the reenactment of a crew that refused to die, of passengers gripping hands while the earth rushed toward them. Social media flooded with comments from people confessing they'd never think of flying the same way again. Airline crews from around the world sent messages of respect, and one major aviation publication named the Stansted recovery the most significant flight save of the 21st century. The captain's quote, "We weren't brave. We were scared to death. We just didn't stop," became a permanent engraving at the Aviation Hall of Honor. But beneath the reverence, there remained a question few dared to ask aloud. Why did the aircraft respond? For years, engineers had tried to explain the strange electrical surge recorded in the final seconds before recovery. It didn't match any power system or failure pattern. It pulsed in rhythm with the pilot's inputs, almost as if the machine had synchronized with the man. To most, it was a data glitch, a quirk of overlapping signals. But to those who had seen the captain's letters, especially the one he'd written weeks before his death, it was something deeper. "When I cut the engines," he had written, "it felt like she took a breath. I can't explain it, but I swear the plane wanted to survive." That single line sparked years of quiet debate among aviation philosophers and psychologists who studied the human-machine relationship. One paper, titled "Empathy in the Cockpit," argued that under extreme stress, a pilot's sensory feedback loop could create a synchronization so strong that it mimicked the response of a living organism. When human instinct aligns perfectly with mechanical rhythm, it read, control ceases to be a command and becomes a conversation. It was an abstract idea, but somehow it felt right. Those who had flown long enough understood. It wasn't science, it was connection. In 2028, a museum exhibit dedicated to human triumphs in aviation opened at Heathrow. At its center stood the reconstructed cockpit of Flight 271, restored from the original components. The first officer attended the opening, his steps slow, his face lined with the years. When he reached the display, he placed his hand on the yoke, the same metal that had nearly broken under pressure, and whispered, "I still hear you." He stayed there for a long time, until a young pilot approached, nervous and reverent. "Sir," the pilot said softly, "they told us about you in training. You're the reason I fly." The older man smiled faintly. "Then promise me one thing," he said. "When everything goes wrong, when the alarms scream and the sky turns against you, don't give up. Machines don't save lives. People do." That night, as he left the museum, a storm rolled over London, the kind of violent, churning squall that mirrored the night of the descent. Thunder cracked, and rain lashed the glass roof of the terminal. The first officer paused, staring up at the lightning-slashed sky, his reflection merging with the streaks of water. For a moment, he thought he heard it again, the faint hum of engines straining, the metallic groan of a plane fighting gravity's pull. He closed his eyes, heart pounding. "It's over," he whispered, though part of him wondered if it ever truly would be. Meanwhile, the airline had grown into one of the largest in Europe, its safety record spotless since the Stansted incident. Yet in an ironic twist of fate, one of its new aircraft, a cutting-edge jet controlled almost entirely by AI, experienced a mid-air systems fault eerily similar to Flight 271's. This time, the crew followed the new emergency protocol. Disengage the system, trust the manual controls, and fly by feel. They landed safely. When investigators reviewed the cockpit transcript, they found one line spoken by the young captain before the final approach. "If Flight 271 taught us anything," he said, "it's that sometimes the sky just wants to see if you're still listening." In the quiet aftermath of that landing, the first officer of the original Stansted flight received a message from the new crew, We remembered your story. It saved us. He sat alone in his office, reading the words over and over. The cycle had come full circle. The nightmare that had nearly destroyed him had become the reason others survived. He looked out the window toward the darkening horizon and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He spent his final years teaching aviation safety, but his lessons went beyond procedures and checklists. He taught empathy, instinct, and trust, the unseen tools that no machine could replicate. He'd tell his students, a plane doesn't fly because of math alone. It flies because someone believes it will. And every time he said those words, he thought of that night, the roar of wind, the glow of rain-streaked glass, the trembling in his hands as he held on for dear life beside a man who refused to let go. When he passed away quietly at age 70, his ashes were scattered from a training aircraft over the North Sea, near the same coordinates where Flight 271 had first entered its descent. The pilot performing the scattering, one of his former students, whispered through the intercom, "For those who never gave up." Below, the sea churned with sunlight and wind, and for an instant, a strange shimmer appeared on the water's surface, a reflection shaped like wings. Today, the legend of Flight 271 endures. Pilots still mention it before their first solo flight. In flight schools, the mantra lives on: when the system fails, listen to the sky. The Stansted near-disaster became more than an aviation story. It became a symbol of human endurance, the moment humanity reminded the heavens that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about refusing to fall even when fear takes the controls. And somewhere, high above the clouds, where silence hums like memory, perhaps that old aircraft still flies, steady, quiet, free, carrying with it the echoes of every heart that once beat inside its walls, whispering through the wind, still flying. Still thankful. It was 20 years after that storm-split night over England when the story of Flight 271 finally settled into legend. Time had softened the horror, sanding down the edges of panic until it became something closer to reverence. Yet for those who had been there, the passengers, the crew, the controllers, time never erased the sound of that descent. The alarms, the hollow thunder of the engines struggling for breath, the captain's calm voice cutting through chaos. The world moved on, building smarter planes and safer skies, but the spirit of that flight endured like a quiet heartbeat beneath every takeoff. It lived in the reflexes of pilots who reached for manual controls when computers glitched, in the trembling prayers of passengers who closed their eyes through turbulence, and in the whisper of the wind across aluminum wings that still remembered what fear felt like. The first officer's death years earlier had marked the end of the human chapter, but not the story itself. Technology had changed everything by then. Aircraft could now land themselves, predict turbulence before it formed, and communicate directly with control systems through quantum link relays. Pilots had become supervisors more than aviators, guardians of a technology that rarely needed their hand. Yet even in this age of perfection, engineers kept a quote carved into the base of every cockpit: "Trust the sky. But trust yourself more." Those 6 words, scrawled long ago in the captain's logbook, had become a kind of prayer for aviation, a reminder that machines could guide you, but humanity would always save you. By 2040, the remains of Flight 271 had been transferred to the National Museum of Flight in Cambridge. Children pressed their hands against the display glass, staring wide-eyed at the battered cockpit that had once held the fate of 176 souls. Tour guides spoke softly, as though raising their voices might wake the ghosts still resting in the metal. They told the story not just of technical failure, but of human instinct, of 2 men who looked into the storm and refused to blink. The museum built a small theater beside the exhibit where the final transmission between tower and cockpit played in a continuous loop, the sound of breath, static, rain, and one steady voice saying, "We're still fighting." Visitors would sit there in silence, listening to that voice echo through the speakers until it faded into nothing, leaving behind a hush that felt sacred. Outside the museum, the next generation of pilots trained in virtual simulators, their world surrounded by holographic recreations of historical disasters. Yet, every training syllabus, no matter how advanced, ended with one required exercise: the Stansted descent. Trainees were told to fly through it without automation, without assistance, just as the captain had done. The instructors would dim the lights, flood the screens with thunderclouds and flickering warnings, and whisper, "Now, fly her by feel." Most failed their first attempt. Some wept afterward. A few, when they finally mastered it, came out of the simulator pale and trembling, whispering, "I understand now." And still, the mystery of that night continued to haunt aviation historians. Every few years, new researchers reopened the data logs, fascinated by the unexplained electrical pulse, the heartbeat that surged through the system seconds before recovery. One group of scientists even attempted to recreate the exact conditions, down to the atmospheric moisture and ice crystals, but they could never reproduce it. The data remained a riddle, defying explanation. Some called it coincidence. Others called it the moment when the human spirit and machine spirit became one. Whatever it was, it had left its fingerprint on the history of flight, an invisible scar between man and sky. In the quiet offices of the International Aviation Board, one archivist, an elderly woman named Dana Keats, the same controller who had once guided Flight 271 from the tower, still worked part-time, helping digitize old communication tape. Her hands shook now, her hair silver, but her memory of that night remained sharp as lightning. Late one evening, while reviewing a batch of declassified recordings, she stumbled upon an audio file mislabeled and forgotten. She pressed play. Through a wash of static came a familiar voice, calm, steady, human. It was the captain, transmitting something the official report had never included. "If anyone hears this, tell them we're not giving up. We'll bring her home." Dana froze, tears welling in her eyes. For years she had believed that final line had been lost in the chaos of failing systems. She whispered into the empty room, "You did, Captain. You brought her home." That rediscovered transmission was later restored and added to the museum's exhibit. When it premiered, people wept. The audio wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was tired, raw, and human. The sound of courage at the edge of collapse. The recording ended with a single breath, then silence. And in that silence, every listener could feel the weight of what had been risked and saved. Outside, storms rolled again across the British countryside, just as they had on that night 2 decades before. Planes rose and fell through the rain, their lights cutting thin paths through darkness. Somewhere among them, a training flight descended into Stansted under low visibility. Inside the cockpit, a nervous student pilot's hands trembled on the controls. "Everything's glitching," he said, panic rising. The instructor beside him, calm and measured, smiled faintly and spoke the same words passed down through generations. "Then stop fighting the numbers. Feel the plane. Trust your hands." The young pilot did, and the jet steadied, slicing cleanly through the fog. When they landed, the instructor laughed softly. "You just flew your first Stansted recovery." The student smiled through relief. "You mean like Flight 271? The instructor nodded. "Exactly like Flight 271. Never forget them." And so, their legacy endured not through monuments or medals, but through every steady hand and heartbeat that followed. Every pilot who whispered, "Fly by feel," in a storm, every controller who believed the impossible was still survivable, every passenger who looked out the window during turbulence and trusted the invisible hands guiding them, all were part of that same story. The human story. Years later, when storms raged once again over Europe, a writer visiting the museum paused before the cockpit of Flight 271. He watched as lightning illuminated the cracked glass and thought of the man who had once sat there, rain streaking down his face, fighting not for glory, but for time. He pressed his palm against the glass and whispered words that had become legend, "Still flying. Still thankful." And somewhere above, where the clouds broke open to reveal the thin blue glow of the upper atmosphere, perhaps something answered. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was imagination, but for a fleeting second, the faint hum of engines filled the air, steady and defiant, echoing across time. The same hum that once rose over Stansted when two men refused to die and taught the world that courage, in the end, isn't about control, it's about faith. Faith in the machine. Faith in the sky. And most of all, faith in the human heart that dares to fly it. Thank you for joining me for this story. If this journey moved you, if you believe in the power of courage and the resilience of the human spirit, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. True tales of survival, fear, and the fragile miracle of flight. Until next time, stay safe, look to the skies, and remember, somewhere out there, humanity is still flying.